Morning. I do want to encourage you to stay for the sacred conversation on race after church. I've spent the last 3 days, Thursday evening, Friday, and Saturday, at a sacred conversation on race that was hosted by a church in San Diego, Christ Lutheran, and it was a remote site for a conference going on at Trinity Church, Wall Street, and it was outstanding. But I came away with one particular feeling and emotion after sitting through those 3 days of conference and breaking down into small groups and listening to the presentations. And that feeling is, we've got a lot of work to do. So we're going to continue the work here at Pilgrim today and throughout this year. I'd like to speak to us this morning from the theme, From Civil to Disobedience. From Civil to Disobedience. You know, the most popular image of Jesus is always that Jesus, sweet and mild and meek Jesus. That's our favorite Jesus. We even had lyrics in our hymn this morning that talked about how compassionate Jesus was. And yes, he is. Yes, he is. But the story in our gospel today, the story of the cleansing of the temple, shows us another side of this self-same Jesus. The one side of Jesus that we often forget, the side of Jesus that we don't like to look at or to remember. A Jesus who was quite in contrast to the Jesus we found just in the preceding chapter in the story of Jesus at Cana. You remember last week there at Cana, we saw the compliant, the cooperative, the civil Jesus. Now, yeah, he protests at first when his mom asked him to perform a miracle, but he quickly complies with his mama's request and provides wine for everyone there at the wedding. He was being civil. But in the next scene, in this very next scene in John's story of Jesus, we watch as Jesus goes from being civil to being disobedient. He arrives in Jerusalem for the first of 3 trips to Passover recorded by John. The other Gospels have Jesus come to Jerusalem, cleanse the temple, he gets in trouble, they put him on trial, and they crucify him. But John's Gospel has a different account of Jesus' ministry, a much longer ministry, covering at least 2 years and maybe more. And this is just the first time that Jesus arrives in Jerusalem at Passover. He arrives at the temple to find animals being sold for sacrifice and tables set up to exchange your dirty Roman money for temple money that might then be donated to the treasury. And Jesus objected. He objected to the marketplace atmosphere that was distracting from the prayerful purpose of the temple. I was trying to think of an analogy that might bring this point home to us. And the only one that came to my mind was, can you imagine if instead of having coffee after church, we set up a cappuccino machine in the narthex and was handing out coffee and donuts? Oh yes, fellowship is important. But I think at one point we'd have to say, enough is enough. This is a house of prayer, not a coffee shop. putting things in their right perspective, I think, is what Jesus objected to. And the animal selling and the money changing at the very gate and entrance to the temple had distorted what he felt was its purpose, had distracted it from the prayerful purpose of the temple. So he drove the animals out and turned over the money changing tables. Now, this action, this very disobedient action, provoked a protest from the religious authorities. And they said, "Who are you to walk in here and tell us how to run the temple? By what authority," the other Gospels say, "do you do this? What sign," to use John's language, "will you give us that you can do this?" His response was very simple. "Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again." Now, they were thoroughly confused. It had taken decades and enormous sums of money and uncalculable hours of human labor to build the temple. And here this one lonely Jesus says that he will rebuild it in 3 days. And this is another continuing theme in the Gospel of John. He always offers those in the audience of the story an option. Do I take this statement literally, or do I take this statement figuratively or spiritually? And every time the audience in the story chooses the literal interpretation, but every time Jesus, or rather the gospel writer John, is intending for the reading audience to see through that, past that, and to the spiritual meaning of the text. And so it is with this story. The wrong way to look at it is literally, how's he going to rebuild this great temple? The right way to look at it is to understand that he's speaking not of the building blocks of the temple, but of the human beings who are truly the people of God and not the building of God. Today we are familiar with the phrase civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, like that of Jesus turning over the tables and driving out the animals, has become a stock practice of oppressed peoples. Not quite strong enough to take up arms against the oppressing powers, but organized enough and powerful within themselves enough to disrupt, to be disobedient to the extent that normal processes can't go on. So when he drove the animals out and turned over the money tables, then people didn't know how to function, and worship stopped, but they had to pay attention to what he was trying to say. And so even in our own time, we see civil disobedience being used in this way. I'd like to highlight 3 movements that have used civil disobedience to bring light and truth to the issues that are important not only to them but to our whole society and to the whole human community. One such movement is the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter is in many ways not new. It's the same issue that we were struggling with in the 60s for civil rights. But now a movement has emerged primarily populated by young people. And not only, or I should say, and just as the civil rights movement, not an exclusively African American movement, but all people of all colors who are concerned that black lives should matter. We've seen too many primarily young black men whose lives were ended, killed, murdered, and no consequences were brought against those who committed the act. And so a movement started to try and draw attention to these deaths that go unadjudicated. And they have devised various means and methods, not the civil methods Oh yes, the regular processes have gone on. There have been lawsuits, there have been charges filed, and there have been exonerations, and in some cases no charges filed. But Black Lives Matter operates a different way. They operate the disobedient way. They'll get in the middle of the 405 freeway at rush hour and shut the city down so that everybody will know that there are bodies hurting, people losing their lives. Another movement is the LGBTQ equality movement. And just this past week, a significant moment in that movement for equality occurred, not here in the United States, but in England, at the Worldwide Anglican Communion. The Anglican Communion, which includes our United States Episcopal Church, but includes Episcopal communions all over the world. Collectively, they are the third largest Christian body on the planet. And this movement for equality is not just a U.S. movement, it is a worldwide movement. And our American expression of Anglicanism as the Episcopal Church continues to press the other Anglican bodies to bring equality to their LGBTQ members, baptized in full communion with their church, yet discriminated against, yet brutalized, and in many of the countries where the Anglican Communion lives, criminalized. And the bishops of these churches are complicit in the deaths of those persons who are killed, arrested, and imprisoned in those nations. The majority of the Anglican Communion gathers together, the whole communion gathers together, but the majority vote against LGBTQ equality. And not only do they vote against it, they are going to sanction the U.S. church for not going along. They're going to punish them for the equality that they find expressed within the Episcopal Church of the United States. Well, this is one time that I would encourage our Anglican, our Episcopal brothers and sisters, please, please, please be disobedient. Please, please, please do not go along to get along. And the seriousness of this should not be underestimated. This would mean a break in that church, a schism in the church of historic proportions. But that is the path that they must walk. Their disobedience to that worldwide Anglican community is the salvation that they know is the only way for their church. There's another new old movement. It's called the New Sanctuary Movement. And in the New Sanctuary Movement, we are once again struggling, as Anna mentioned, to bring attention to the plight of families that are being torn apart, families and persons, mothers and children and fathers and brothers and sisters who are no threat to our security, but are simply trying to hold their family together, make a living, and feed their children. I'd like to show us a short video that will demonstrate what disobedience might mean. Oops. You going to give it to me then?
Big story developing this morning. Homeland Security is readying a series of immigration raids. The targeted raids would be the first large-scale effort to deport families who have fled violence in Central America.
Afraid to step out of their homes, rumors of immigration raids.
They're going after women and children now.
Stop deportation! Stop deportation! Immigration reform!
What do we want it?
A little more volume.
What I I've come to believe about sanctuary is that sanctuary is not so much about finding refuge within four walls and a roof. It's about finding shelter within the community. And so in the midst of the failure of elected leadership, religious leadership is standing up. Congregations are rising to the occasion, and they're standing up and they're standing between deportation orders and families to say, you cannot separate this mother from her children. You can't do that. People sometimes focus too much on the logistics, and I always tell people, if God is calling you to this work, not everyone is called to this work, not every church is called to the work of sanctuary, but those churches who are called to it, we always tell them, if this is what God is calling you to do, discern that first. And if that's what God is calling you to do, the logistics will fall into place.
We faith leaders will continue to work every single day until not one more family is separated, not one more mother or father is taken from their children, not one more son or daughter is taken from their parents, not one more husband or wife is separated from their spouse, not one more.
So what is it that all three of these movements have in common? They all are trying to raise the bodies of those who have been killed. Just as Jesus said, tear down this temple, meaning his body, and he'll raise it up again. Because the truth is, you cannot kill a movement. In each of these movements, the bodies of human beings are at risk and at stake. Bodies become very important in each of these movements. One of the issues that really brought attention to the Black Lives Matter movement was the way the body of Michael Brown was treated in St. Louis, in Ferguson. How his body just laid in the street for hours and hours. In the LGBTQ movement, one of the things that the straight community has often remarked upon is how bodies impact the issue, how gender compliance is not always apparent to the straight community, but the movement is saying my body is my body, and I present myself to the world the way that God has created me. And of course, the sanctuary movement is about the bodies of these persons that are left in the desert to die, that are imprisoned and deported and separated from their loved ones. But the movement goes on in spite of the deaths of these bodies, because you cannot kill a movement of truth. You cannot kill a movement of righteousness. You cannot kill a movement toward freedom. So the question remains to us, Pilgrim. Are we ready? Are we ready? You don't know what the question is yet. Are we ready to turn over some tables? Let the people of God say, amen.